Welcome. I am just so thrilled. There's so many of you here on a Friday morning to talk about death and dying. I'm very excited about it because I do death all day, every day, all the time, and so I'm very into it. But I realize it can be a difficult subject for a lot of people. My name's Imperi. I'm a designer, and my postgraduate work is in typeface design. I was very fortunate I got accepted to the Cooper Union's type program, so that's where my training there came from. And I'm a dual certified thanatologist. Does anybody know what the word thanatology means? So some of you do, very good. So thanatology is the study of death and dying, and there are thousands of thanatologists just in the United States. And the way that I describe it, thanatology is an enhancer. So there's no such thing as a full-time job where you can just like walk around and know about death and dying, although I'm trying very hard to make that happen. So a lot of people will become thanatologists to enhance the things that they already do. So maybe they're a psychologist and they want to be able to help people that are struggling with loss, so they start to study thanatology. It enhances the things that they already do. Okay. I want to talk about the difference between these two very important words, death versus dying. So death, in my experience, can sometimes be the easy part, because when somebody or something dies, it's pretty clear what needs to happen, right? When someone dies, there's kind of a process we follow. We know we have to do something because there's a dead body. Dying, the dying part, is much more complex, much more complicated, messy, and there's not this clear process that we can look to figure out how to navigate it. One of the interesting conversations that happens within thanatology a lot is about, when do we start dying? When do we start dying? Is it the day you're at the doctor's office and you get a terminal diagnosis? Or were you dying the day before you got that diagnosis? Some people would argue that you start dying the moment you're born or the moment you're conceived. And I've had somebody theorize that we technically start dying the moment that your mother is conceived, because part of what makes you you is in her. So when do we start dying? And then on top of that, how do we handle it? So that's the area that I'm most interested in, and the impact that dying has on the way that we live. In this talk, I'm going to cover, I thought it'd be helpful. So I've worked with death and dying for well over a decade, and I've approached it from the design side. Businesses in death and dying hire me to help make what they do better. So I've worked with death and dying in a lot of ways, and I thought I would share with you 5 of the biggest sort of lessons that death has taught me, and hopefully one of those 5 things, hopefully you leave here and it resonates with you. So the first thing, big deaths versus little deaths. This is my own terminology, but a big death is any time a person or an animal that we love or cared about dies. It's a big loss. A little death is sort of a type of loss that doesn't have a dead body attached to it. So a divorce, or you got fired, or you finally negotiated that contract and then the project got canceled and you're devastated. Or a little death could be if you've ever been ghosted by somebody, a friend, and they just like disappear. That can be a little death. So these are both losses that we can sustain and experience in our lives. The challenge point that I see is many times the hard stuff, the hardest, messiest stuff, doesn't come from the big deaths. It comes from the little deaths. Because when somebody dies, yes, it's sad, yes, it's awful and terrible, but our brains are better at understanding that kind of loss. It's harder for us to understand the non-dead thing losses. So what helps? Just being able to recognize that that divorce you're going through or the business partnership that's splitting up, if you can recognize that's a loss and you're probably grieving, you're probably going to have an easier time moving through that period of your life. Next we have the big voice and the little voice. As designers, you all have probably encountered this issue. So how many of you, okay, self-help stuff and motivational books and things, a lot of times the messaging that comes across to those things is be who you're supposed to be, right? Be the thing you're supposed to be, do the thing you're supposed to do, discover your purpose, be who you are, right? But how do you know how to do that? So the big voice inside of our minds, and just kind of roll with me here. Imagine that inside your minds, if you close your eyes and you listen, you have a big voice and a little voice in there. The big voice, the loud voice, the voice that's easy to find and easy to hear, that's your ego. The ego, super easy to hear. And the ego wants to prevent you from being who you're supposed to be, from becoming what you're supposed to become, from finding your purpose in life and doing it. The little voice is quiet, it's harder to hear, it speaks softly and using just a few words. That's your inner voice. That's the voice of who you're supposed to be. And we spend our whole lives listening to the big voice and tuning out the little voice until sometimes we wake up one day and realize we've spent our entire careers not doing the things that we actually wanted to do. So if you all are sitting there and I ask you, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to listen in your mind for what the big voice says and what the little voice says, and see if they're the same or different. I'm going to ask it. What are you supposed to do with your life? The big voice usually is loud and says, you need to start 16 restaurants and have an empire that dominates fast food in the United States. The little voice is often saying things like, be a mother, be happy, it's simple, it's short. Spending time thinking about this and trying to listen to the little voice and not being angry at what the little voice says, because a lot of times the little voice is going to say the thing that we might have been ignoring or pushing off or trying to get it to say something different our whole lives. I know I have been there, and I will touch on that in a little bit. So the big voice and the little voice, the big voice has tools that it uses to try to keep you from being who you're supposed to be. Rumination. The big voice tries to get you to obsess about the past. Does anybody in here rehearse conversations you've had where you said something that was like maybe slightly embarrassing, but probably not? I do this regularly. It's actually a hobby of mine, just like rehashing things from 4th grade. So that's, they're still with me. So, so the big voice gets you to ruminate, and rumination is a tool to distract you from actually doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing in your life. So when you catch yourself rehashing stuff that happened in the past, recognize that's a tool, that's a distraction that's being thrown in your path. Worry is the second tool that the big voice, the ego voice, uses to throw you off your horse. And worry is putting you in the future, a time that does not yet exist. It's good to have an awareness about, this is coming up next month, I've got to be prepped. That's one thing. But if you are kind of obsessively worrying about things, what I find is if you're someone who ruminates a lot, you kind of dwell on stuff in the past, you're probably also somebody who then will flip to worrying about things that have not yet happened either. And so you end up jumping between the two. And that is keeping you out of your purpose of finding out who you're supposed to be. The little voice has the tool of presence. Have you ever met somebody, or you've been in a party and somebody walks in the room and they just are there and you don't know the person, but they show up and you're just like, whoa, who is that? that person has a lot of presence. They're very firmly rooted in the here and the now. And this is the gift that the little voice can give you. If you listen to it, if you pay attention to it, if you remind yourself every day what the little voice is saying, that will keep you rooted in the present so that you're not living in a future that doesn't exist or living in a past that is long gone. Third thing, death is the salt of life. So working with end of life, I'm a hospice volunteer. I've been with people as they're actively dying. And working in death care. Death care is the term that we use to describe the sort of end of life profession or end of life businesses. So it's like funeral homes, cemeteries, crematories, that's death care. I've worked in all those in different ways over the years. And when somebody dies, and the funeral happens, there's something that is very commonly left behind and something that people want. And it's grandma's chocolate chip cookie recipe, or Uncle Dave's biscuit recipe, or mom's chicken noodle soup recipe. Recipes are often this thing that we leave behind. We spend a lifetime making it and bringing it to the family functions. And then we die, and after we die, we're not around to see what's left behind. But a lot of times what we leave behind are the recipes that we've made. And so what I mean by when I say death is the salt of life, you as human beings, as individuals, each of you are creating your own recipe right now, trial and error of the self. Imagine that you are a soup, okay? And you spend your whole life meeting people, doing things, learning things, visiting places. And imagine that each of those things are ingredients that you're putting into your soup. So the more stuff that you do, the more places you visit, the more goals that you try to achieve, that's going to add depth and complexity to your flavor. If you're somebody who is resistant to change, avoids everything, wants to just keep yourself totally separate from the world, you're going to be kind of flavorless. And at the end of your life, nobody's going to want the recipe. Nobody's going to want to know what made you you. And I'm not saying that that's the motivating factor for how you should live your life, because you want to die and then you want everyone to be like, man, I wish I had that recipe. But the point is, we're all developing the recipe of our lives. And have this outlook of embracing new ingredients, because it will just add complexity and flavor and memorability. And how many of you remember having a wonderful meal or a wonderful dish or just food memories? People remember interesting people like they remember interesting foods. And so I guess wake up in the morning and check in with the fact that you are a soup. And today you can maybe add a new ingredient to that soup, or you can just let it simmer. Okay, I'm going to do a little exercise with you guys. How many of you know what an obituary is? Wonderful, okay. We're going to write an obituary today. So the reason we're doing this is because it is a very powerful way to check in with how your soup's coming along. So on a lot of the chairs, I put an index card. You can use that to write on or see if somebody else needs one. Do it on your phone. I don't care. The purpose of this is for it to be quick and just to kind of listen to the little voice and put down just the truth. I'm not going to ask you to read it. I'm not going to collect them. It's totally private. So this is the structure of most obituaries. You start with the basics. Oh, and all of you died today. Today is your date of death. So it would start with Imperi, 32, of Cincinnati, died on Friday, November 17th, 2017, after giving a talk about death. Then you do the biography. What's your job? Like, where did you volunteer? Do you have a motto? Where did you go to school? Then obituaries usually touch on who you leave behind and who came before, like who died before you. Then service time and location. If you don't want flowers, what charity do you want something donated to? And so as you write this, I want you to think not necessarily of you writing it, but I want you to think about who would probably be tasked with writing your obituary if you literally died today. Who would be tasked with doing that? And then what would they say about your life? That can help you see maybe that you need to be more vocal about the things that you're doing in your own life so that people know what you're doing. So if you can, I'd like you to think who would write that and this service time and location. If you died today, where do you think you would end up? What funeral home? You know, who would be making those arrangements? That may or may not be something that you actually want to happen, but it's worth thinking about. So what's going to happen is I'm going to give you 90 seconds to do this, starting right now. Begin. I know I asked you to do this really quickly. People spend like entire days writing obituaries, so you did it in under 2 minutes. So, okay. Did we give it a shot? Raise your hands. Okay, very good. Okay. Keyword, existential pain. This is something that we look at in Death and Dying, and it is a term that refers to what some might call the pain of living. And a lot of times we really deal with existential pain at the end of our lives, like as we're dying or before we're dying. And one of the things that causes this is the realization about choices we made in how we lived our lives. The realization about things we did or didn't do. Also conflicts related to values and our religious beliefs, or the conflict between the religious belief that you might have been raised in and your family is, but you're not that, and there's question about, well, should I, am I being disrespectful to my family by not believing what they believe? That's existential pain. And if you wrote your obituary out, how many of you had an obituary and you're like, next level, done, it's perfect? Did anybody have an obituary that they're so happy with? That's good. That's great. That's wonderful. Then you are on the path. But for those of you that saw it or were thinking in the mind of the person who'd end up writing it, hopefully this leads you to make some changes. And that's the great news, is you're not dead today. You get to leave here and make different choices and be thoughtful about what you're doing or not doing in your life. So I want to talk a little bit about purpose. And this idea of everybody has a purpose and you can be who you want to be and all of that. Working with death and dying so much, I have had the benefit of meeting people on their deathbeds who actually did a thing where they said, this is what I realized I was put here to do, and I did it. And it's incredibly potent and powerful. And once you see somebody that is living whatever it is that they're put here to do, or seeing someone that believes that they have a thing they're supposed to do, they found it and they did it. It is incredible, and you want to get that if you can get it. My purpose, I worked for a long time at really trying to figure out why I exist, and it may not actually be why I exist, but it's a reason that I feel good about and comfortable with, and that motivates me and makes me excited to wake up every single day. I believe that my purpose is to change the way that we live for the positive in the United States in my lifetime through learning about death and dying. And I balls out believe that that is what I'm here to do, and that's what I'm doing. For years, I really struggled with that big voice, because the big voice was like, be a nurse, be a doctor, be a lawyer, be something that fits really nicely and makes a lot of sense and is clean on the edges and nobody's confused about, and you don't have to explain yourself. But the whole time, the little voice was not saying those things, and I wasn't listening to it. And I spent a lot of years, most of my 20s, trying desperately to not have death be what I got. I mean, Michael Jordan got basketball and was awesome at it. And I'm like, I get death. Death is it? That's what I get? So I had to come to terms with sometimes you're good at something. That's just what I'm good at. And you just have to say, okay, well, I'm going to try to roll with it. And so far, so good. So number 4, what do people regret? So sitting there looking death in the face directly, what is the thing that people tend to regret most of all? People regret most of all what they didn't do, what they did not do. All of us wish at the end of our lives that we watched less TV and spent more time with the people we loved. That's a blanket thing that everybody wishes they did more of. But this, not starting the business that you've always wanted to start, not having that kid that you wanted to have, not chasing that girl that you just love, not giving it a go. That is the stuff that you will regret at the end of your life. And when you lay there dying, it's going to be on your mind. I see it time and time again. And the good news is you're aware of that now. So figure out the things that you're avoiding doing or putting off, and either do them or try to make peace with them in some way. This is me with a human skull in a box. I want to tell you about this word. This word remains. It's a word I coined in 2009, and it is a portmanteau of digital remains. I was brought into a cemetery that had a break-in in a mausoleum. Like somebody broke in and just like tore it up. And so everything was everywhere. It happens. And I was brought in to gather up the pieces and kind of clean it up, which is crazy because like the people who actually worked at the cemetery were apparently afraid of ghosts, and then they thought we need to call Cole, and I'm like, yeah, I'll be there. So yeah, totally normal. Let me put on my silver shiny Keds and my cute jean shorts, and I'll be there in an hour. So that's normal for me. So as I was working with the staff members on this, the thing that struck me and I thought about was like, that was a person who had a whole life, who pooped and peed and made food and had relationships, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know what this person's life was like, but there's physical remains. We spend a lot of our lives being very caught up in this idea that our physical body is attached to who we are, but all of the stuff this man did in his life, there's no record of it in the bones that are left behind. Remains are your digital remains, and I'd argue that this is a way that people are going to get to know you after you've long gone. Imagine you die today, and in 20 years, your niece or nephew or a little cousin gets assigned at school a project where they have to research a deceased family member. They pick you, and where are they going to get information about you? They're going to look at Facebook, they're going to look at Instagram, they're going to look at all the stuff that you left behind online. What would they learn about you? Is what you're leaving behind online telling an accurate story, or is what you're leaving behind being fed by the big voice or being fed by the little voice? So that's something to keep in mind and hopefully carry with you and consider what your remains will be, because we all are going to leave behind bones. Well, that's cut and dry. The death part is easy. And we're all also going to leave behind junk online, and we owe it to ourselves and people in the future to have an awareness about the junk that we are leaving there. Fifth, don't expect to be discovered. I see this a lot. Deep down, every single person will say, everyone will say, no, I'm not special, like there's no such thing as special. But deep down, we all believe that we secretly are kind of amazing. And we have like this secret special thing that we're really good at, but it's like hidden and we're gonna be low key about it. That's just how humans work. We all have that belief. I see people that end up with huge regrets because they feel like they're next level about something. But they're like waiting for someone to come and find them and then bring it out of them. Don't wait to be discovered. Don't wait for somebody else to come and roll out a red carpet and be like, be the great thing that you think that you are inside. Actually do it. The discoverer, the person who does the discovering, has more to gain than the person who's being discovered. The discoverer is the one with the upper hand and the most to gain. So consider in your own life trying to be the discoverer instead of the person that just sits there and hopes to maybe one day get discovered. And what happens is I see people that then get bitter and angry because they never had their chance. Nobody ever came and gave them their chance. That is a false boundary. You all have the same opportunities and abilities. You just have to be willing to put your neck out there a little bit and give it a go. This is my motto in my life. And this is the typeface that I designed while I was in school at Cooper Union. I took a rubbing of a headstone at Spring Grove Cemetery and then built it out into what became this typeface. I have, as a Midwestern gal from the northern suburbs of Cincinnati, I have struggled a lot in my life with the shoulds, like, oh, I should be this way, or like, oh, I should not have purple hair, or I should whatever. And I've spent a lot of time and energy worrying about that little stuff, or worrying about like responding to emails like immediately and on time, or like super double checking the words that I write and oh my God, did I say the right thing? When I die, none of that matters. None of that's going to show up in my obituary, but the stuff that I actually do, my actions, that's what matters. And so this is the thing that, for whatever reason, it motivates me to check in and be reminded about what really matters and what I actually need to be focusing on. On that note, I want to tell you about a project that I'm kind of scared shitless about. So I've been reading tarot cards since I was a kid. And I've also figured out that I love talking to people about their lives and what they're afraid of. Hopefully it's death, because that's my jam. So my husband and I, several years ago, we had a morning radio show. And so we're going to start a podcast called Life, Death, and Tarot, where we do a reading and I talk to you. And so if you're interested, if you're local, you can go to this website and sign up to be one of the subjects. So that is my talk. That is the 5 things that I thought might have some value to be shared with you. And we do have some time for some questions. Hopefully somebody might have something they want to ask. And you can ask about death stuff, dying stuff. It doesn't have to be what I talked about. Mm-hmm.
Well, you mentioned that when you were trying to figure out your purpose in life, you realized that you were good at death.
Mm-hmm.
How do you discover something like that?
So the question was, when I was struggling with understanding my purpose in life and I like had the realization that it's death, how does that happen? It's a bit of a process because I had to start listening to it, and also my job, my career, isn't something that fits into a clean box. It's not like Cole's an attorney. We understand what that means. I'm a thanatologist and designer, which like literally, I think I'm the only one of those. So at first, I started paying attention to when I felt really good and when I felt really alive and really happy and really positive. And it was most often when I was having conversations with people about really intense subjects, usually related to a loss of some kind. And this was happening at parties. I have this beacon that I send out. Like you can ask my husband who's over there. If we go out to the mall, somebody will come up to me and I'll end up talking to them about this horrific loss that they're dealing with. It just happens. So what I did is I started observing. I stopped talking and started just listening and seeing where those alive moments were happening. And I saw that the thread was death. And I saw that there was this death thread going back to childhood for me. So observing the patterns, being open to the idea that the thing that I'm supposed to do may not be a clean-cut job that has a clear job description. And then once I kind of figured out that theme was death, I had to spend some time really thinking about that, because death can be exhausting. It can be tiring. It can really wear you out. And I've definitely had moments where I was like, I cannot. Last year, I was very burnt out from it, and I'm like, I can't do this. Like, I need a break. But then I learned I have to figure out where the balance is. So observing and listening. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Yes?
You said you sit with people who are in the process of dying.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one story that impacted you the most, or did you remember the most?
Question was, I sit with people who are dying. Is there one story or something that impacted you the most? Every death is different. People die in different ways. And some deaths can be might have more physical pain involved or discomfort, but other deaths have no physical pain, but it's all mental anguish. Witnessing people die has been such a gift. I'm getting emotional because when you see regret flash across somebody's face, you cannot leave that room and keep making the same choices that you were making before. It is such a gift to be able to see that because we are so dumb. Humans are dumb. Like, people spend their whole lives just like distracting themselves with TV and whatever your distraction of choice is. But when you're with someone who's actively dying, and if you ever witness somebody that's got a regret, you're going to make some changes. So your question was if I have a specific experience, and it's not so much specific because there's so many little moments with the dying process, but the theme of them all is that anytime you get to witness death in some way, it's a second chance for you to choose to live.
What was your first experience with loss?
My first experience with loss, child, probably 2nd or 3rd grade. My best friend Katie, her fish died. And like any good Catholic children in the suburbs of Cincinnati, we were like, we need to have a funeral, obviously. So we made a program, and we went out in the backyard, and we had a procession, and we got the fish in a box, and we were like examining this dead fish, and I was like, look how it's changing colors. And we spent, I remember an entire afternoon about this fish and just like loving the fish, remembering the fish. And so I've never had like a traumatic death experience. I haven't died, obviously, so I didn't have that experience. But as a kid, I was always really comfortable with death and dying, and that's one of those things, the patterns I figured out. Last year, my childhood best friend Katie, her mom mailed me a card she saved from 3rd grade that I wrote to Katie when their first family dog died. And I wrote this like sympathy note as a 3rd grader. I didn't grow up in death. I didn't grow up in a funeral home. I don't come from a family where we're like into talking about deep stuff, so I don't know where it came from. But as a kid, my first experiences were like facilitating the expression of loss and grief. So.
Do you have any experiences with entities?
With what?
Near-death experiences, and how does that differ from what you see?
The question was about near-death experiences and if I have any experience like being around that or with that. So there's actually an international organization that has a database that they collect near-death experiences from all over the world and log them and look for patterns. One of the interesting findings from this database is that visitors, like someone you love dies and they show up in a dream. The most common experience after somebody dies is a grandmother visiting a granddaughter in a dream. That's by far the most common reported like after death. Now with near-death experiences, there is quite a bit of a field of study there, and a lot of people look at that to understand the death process, like the moments leading up to your actual death. What happens in the brain, what happened, like what do you remember? But there's a question about a near-death experience isn't actually death because you came back. So is it actually death? It's near death. So what can we really learn about actual death from a near-death experience? I actually have a neighbor that lives near me that was clinically dead for 20 minutes. And so it's been interesting to have talked to him and witness somebody who actually lived that and how it changed his life and all that. So the thing I have to say about that is there's a question about is a near-death experience death? They might be very different. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Have you ever encountered someone, had experience with someone who celebrated death? Like they looked forward to it. It was something very positive.
Yes. So there are several instances in which I've seen people like celebrate or being excited about their own death.
Well, not suicidal, but they
Yeah.
die.
Yep.
And they want it to be a positive thing.
Yes. When I was in thanatology school, there were several people that were in the program with me who were getting certified in thanatology so that they could prepare for their own deaths, because they didn't want to be left with any regret. They wanted to be educated about the process. When you're actively dying, the body has kind of a typical shutdown process. They wanted to be prepared for this so that they could meet it and embrace it fully and experience the whole deal. And death is a life cycle event. We have to go through it. It is normal, it is expected, it's what makes us human. Death is what makes life special. Life wouldn't have meaning unless we died. And I think more and more, I'm seeing more and more people not look at like having to make final arrangements or just like do their will as like this negative thing. There is some positive there. Because like you guys just did that obituary exercise, hopefully some of you are like, man, I need to really get on this and make changes. In a way, you're embracing your own end of life by making corrections to how you're living your life today. Anybody else? Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about the difference between a sudden death? I have a number of experiences in my life. My brother died very suddenly at the age of 33. And tomorrow is the second anniversary of my father dying, who was in hospice for 18 months. And it was a fabulous experience because we were so embraced by the hospice people. He had 2 wakes while he was alive.
Oh, wow.
And it was really an awesome experience. But 15 years later, my brother's death has much more of an impact on me because of its suddenness and unexpectedness than the one I was able to accompany my dad.
And have that preparation for. So the question was about sudden death versus death that you have a little bit of a heads up on. I'm sorry for your losses. That's really tough. And he's 33. That's young. Okay, sudden death, like totally unexpected. Many times I encounter people who are really struggling with a sudden death in their life or their families. And some of the discomfort or the concern is coming from a worry about the person who died. But when you die suddenly, and it's not like you're necessarily aware. I mean, you're moving into death. So don't worry about the person who has died suddenly, because when death happens very suddenly, it happens quick. It's not like it was this long, drawn-out death process over months or weeks. The example you gave, where there was a sudden death and then her father had 18 months of hospice, which is amazing. Hospice is wonderful. And if you can be on it that long, I mean, it really improves the quality of your life. Sudden deaths are a shock, and they're very difficult for us to process because in terms of a relationship, like my husband, I have a relationship with my husband, obviously. So if he were to just die today, the amount of love and emotion and relationship exchange that I have with him every single day, where's that going to go tomorrow? Where is all this energy exchange going to go? And that is what, and this is just my theory or idea, that is what I think people who deal with a sudden loss are really experiencing, is the sudden shift of energy. So when your father you had 18 months, you had these predefined energy exchanges with people for the relationship, like the wakes. So you had this time to process and taper it and feel it changing. But when you have a sudden loss, you don't get any of that. And it can be very disorienting and jolting to your system to try to navigate it. It's like the rug gets pulled out from under you. And there is no remedy to make that easier or sweeter or softer, but I do recommend that you try to embrace it. If you feel sad or you're upset about it and it's 15 years later, be upset about it. I also encourage people to have funerals on your own. Do it at your desk at work. I mean, sometimes I've started to do this over the years. If I have a little death in my life, like let's just say I lose a contract or a client, I'll have like a little funeral moment for it sitting at my desk, and I'll like write it on a Post-it and put it there, and I'll like say my thoughts, and I do find that actually helps. Humans have been participating in funerary rituals for over 10,000 years, documented, so our brains are used to that and are expecting that. So don't withhold that from yourself biologically, because it has a lot of benefit. Also, sudden loss. There was a study that came out, and it found that one of the most difficult points after a sudden loss, particularly parents that lose children, is 18 years after that loss. That's where it swings back, and it tends to be real back in your life again. So you just have to accept it, embrace it, move with it. Do we have time for more questions? Or, okay, anybody else? Bill?
This is a setup question. Could you talk a little about body disposition?
Yes.
In particular, through burial?
Yes, we have Bill Gupton here, who is starting a green cemetery here in Cincinnati, Ohio, if any of you are in need of one of those in the future. So body disposition methods.
Or if you're interested in helping start.
Helping, yes, we need help. Body disposition methods. So when you die, there's two things that happen: the funeral ritual and the body disposition. And they're different. You can be cremated, you can be buried, you can be buried traditionally or like in a green cemetery. That's what I want, and I've seen all the disposition methods. I want to be wrapped in a shroud and just buried in the earth. There's something called promession, where you get like basically shaken into little dust. There's something called alkaline hydrolysis, which is your body plus water plus lye. Anybody in here ever make soap? You use lye in soap making. And then the end product, so you get kind of dissolved, liquefied, and then all the liquid drains off, and you're left with the same end product as cremation. We can call it dust. So those are the main, okay, then you can also be frozen. Those are the main sort of disposition methods, or donating your body to science. The funeral is separate from all of those, and it doesn't matter what you choose to do with your body. The funeral is different, and I always highly recommend having a funeral. Don't skip that. The funeral is for the people that are left behind. Our brains and bodies are used to, built for, and expect to have this group mourning situation happen. So don't ever underestimate the importance and value of a funeral. Great question. Yes? Oh, yes. Funerals can be parties. New Orleans is one of my favorite towns because they have the jazz lines when there's a funeral procession and there's the music and the exuberance. I do think that the celebration of life, this idea is really important, but I also think it's important to always pair that with moments of sadness, because death is one of the most intimate things in life you can experience with other people. As evidenced by my party conversation, often ends up in the land of death, and people tell me about losses they've had, and I leave every party with a deep connection with somebody. Death can jump you right into a meaningful, deep, intimate connection, and vulnerability is scary. So don't be afraid to talk about death with somebody, and if you're feeling uncomfortable, recognize you're just feeling vulnerable, but embrace it. Death and sadness knits you together. But I love funerals where there's like the moments for the sadness, but it ends on that high note to kind of bring you up out of it. I think that's one of the best formats. Great question. Yes?
So having seen so many people at the end of life, do you think, it's not a religious thing, but do you believe there's some sort of afterlife?
So the afterlife question is one of my favorite things to sit and think about. So what happens after we die? I don't know, I haven't died, and nobody knows, and that's part of the problem. So one of the things I look at is different theological traditions, different religions, and they all have something to say about what happens after you die. They also all have something to say about when you become a real deal life. It's called ensoulment. Ensoulment is, each tradition will say, you're not a real human until, in Judaism, the 40th day of gestation. You're a life then. Like there's specific start dates and sort of things that are end dates. I studied a lot of Tibetan Buddhism, and they are next level with their death and dying. When you die, if you're a Tibetan Buddhist, a chart is cast, like a horoscope chart for the moment of your death, and then that is used to calculate how much time you need to not be touched for your soul to peel away from your body. It might be a day, it might be 3 days. It depends. So if you look at it just from the Tibetan Buddhism side of things, so the afterlife starts with this period of your soul peeling away from your body. So there's like stages. I have to say, in my years with death and dying, like when I started out, I knew it all. The more I learn, the less I know. And what I have found today is I just am constantly open-minded to the possibility. I do, from a scientific perspective, the stuff that makes you you, the junk that makes up your body, has always been on the earth. It was here before, you're going to die, and it will be here long after you're decayed and gone. And so how do we define afterlife? I mean, you're still here on the earth, but then there's this idea of the soul, and is there a soul, and what does that look like, and how does that work? So unfortunately, my answer to that is we don't know, but there's plenty of options that seem to be out there. Okay, are we good? Okay, one more.
So, on that, a soul peeling away from the body, and you saying about your brother who died when he was 33, and my brother died, my oldest brother died when he was 27, and I was 20, and it was a sudden death. And I felt like he was around for a while. That his spirit took a while to leave. And my mom had experiences actually seeing his face in various places, 2 different places in her house, and in a church that she liked to stop in. And so, and I wondered for a long, and still do, like, what was that like for David as he got hit by a car, flew through the body, through the air, hit the ground,
And was ripped out of life.
and brainstem. And then was kept alive on life support while they tested his brain. So,
What?
and then I had an experience of late after I had an experience before he died that I remembered after he died of getting out of a car with some friends and running into a fire hydrant, but I didn't see the fire hydrant, which is why we run into it, and had the experience of my brain like trying to figure out what is going on. There was pain, and now I'm sort of falling, but what the hell is going on? And so I was like, is that what happened with David? Because he hit the
Hit it.
car.
So the question sort of about sudden death and like what's the experience of that like as you sort of die. So different religious traditions have things to say about that, and also the near-death experience world tells us that many people who end up like on intensive care or on full-on life support, they'll come back and report like very specific memories of nurses or things that happened to them. Like somebody came back from a near-death experience, they were on intensive care forever, and they remembered a red balloon. And somebody had brought a red balloon into the room. It was in there for like a couple days in the middle of this comatose state. They remembered it. When people die suddenly, many traditions will say that those traumatic transitions into death, the body's good. The body knows how to die. But the soul, the spirit, the mind, whatever you want to call it, the traditional beliefs generally say that the people tend to hang around, or they can hang around because they're confused and like, what the heck? I was just having coffee and there's my body over there. And I don't judge any of this. I just stay open mind to it. I think it can be very helpful if you're someone who's experienced that, just to know what all these other traditions have been saying in some cases for hundreds of years. So the transition to being a dead person can be difficult. And I have a recent example. A girlfriend of mine died recently, and I didn't know that she was dead. And this past weekend, I was at a cabin, chilling, and all of a sudden I was reading this book about death, because that's what I do, and I was overwhelmed with her. Just thought of her, and we don't live anywhere near each other, and I'm just like, oh, and I just got goosebumps telling you this. And she had very, very recently died, but I didn't know it yet. And you know what? That's a comfort to me. And if it's a comfort to you, take it and run with it, embrace it. So that's our last question. Thank you. Great questions.